Welcome back, this is Mark Stump, October 2013. I'd like to talk about RAW files and JPEG files. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of RAW and or JPEG? The advantage of shooting RAW is that you keep all of the data that your camera ever had its hands on with regard to each photo. So you have maximum flexibility later on when it comes to editing. The only disadvantage that I can see, well, okay, I can come up with two. The RAW files do take up a little more room on your memory card and on your computer's hard drive. If you're taking many shots per second for more than a couple of seconds, then it could affect how many shots you could take before your buffer runs out. You know, if you're shooting RAW, maybe you can only take 10 shots at the full rate of, 5 per second. Whereas if you were shooting JPEG, maybe you could shoot for 3 seconds before, 3 or 4 seconds before you run into trouble with your camera's buffer. The disadvantage of JPEGs is that some data has been lost, and in particular you might have problems editing for white balance, which brings me to one of my two stories for today. I was at a Christmas party one year and I was shooting JPEGs back then. I just put a flash on my camera after having set custom white balance for the overhead lights. And I got a picture which was a great moment. But when I looked at the computer later on, I looked at it a few seconds later, and it was all blue. And so, of course, I realized that my white balance was messed up, and I fixed it. But that shot was still just shades of blue. And when I got it onto my computer and tried to edit it, I couldn't get any other colors out of it. As far as my computer was concerned, that shot was composed of different shades of blue, just blue, blue, blue. So I converted it to black and white, and as black and white, it was still kind of nice. But I never got all the colors back that were there in real life, and I would have had I been shooting in RAW. When your camera creates a JPEG file, it makes a decision with regard to contrast and white balance, and then it compresses the file, and so some data is lost. On the subject of compression, I'd like to tell you my second story for the day, and that's that when I was in junior high school, and maybe this has happened to you, it would sometimes happen that I would get a quiz which was barely readable. And the reason the quiz was barely readable is that it was a copy of 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 an original that my teacher had 6 years ago. But apparently she couldn't be bothered or trusted to keep track of the original and make copies only of the original, rather than making copies of copies. The same thing can happen to you with JPEGs if you're not careful. Now, there are some pieces of software that will protect you from that. There are some pieces of software that will hold on to the first copy you give it, and it won't let you edit that. It'll let you edit copies of that. So you have to be careful there. If you're not careful, you can do the same thing to your JPEG that my teacher did to her quiz. You can edit copies or edit edits, and the quality will be diminished each time. With RAW files, it's always the case that your original will be untouched and available to you, and never be diminished. So, what have we covered so far? You have a choice between RAW and JPEG. The RAW is larger, the JPEG is smaller, the RAW is more flexible. The JPEG, I should have mentioned, one advantage of JPEGs is that everybody knows how to read a JPEG. raw files, you can sometimes have trouble viewing them unless you have the right software. Whereas JPEGs, everybody's computer knows how to read a JPEG. With raw files, what would normally happen is you use your editing software to edit the file, get exactly what you want, and then create a JPEG. So you still have your raw file that you can go back to whenever you want, but to put it online or to share it with somebody else, you create a JPEG. And so it does take a little more time on your computer later on. Now, okay, third story. I like to joke that all of the buttons, all of those buttons and dials on your camera are opportunities for you to avoid one mistake and walk smack into another mistake. And when it comes to aperture, shutter speed, ISO, I think that's often the case. When it comes to focus modes, I certainly think that's the case. One focus mode allows you to get out of trouble in one situation, but gets you into trouble in a different situation. Metering modes, same thing. I don't think that's the case here with RAW versus JPEG. For me, this is the one time when there's hardly any downside to one choice. For me, the RAW has all the advantages and none of the disadvantages, at least in that moment. In the moment when I'm taking the picture, there's no disadvantage. Later on, when I'm on the computer, I have to wait a little longer. I have to let the computer crunch on the file longer. But in that moment, I see no disadvantage to using the RAW file. And RAW files are larger, but in my camera, I have 160 gigabytes worth of memory card, so I don't worry about the size. Oh, and your camera may allow you to shoot both. Your camera may have a couple of card slots. My camera allows me to shoot RAW to one card and JPEG to another card. And actually that's what I do. I shoot RAW plus normal JPEG. I consider those JPEGs just an emergency backup, just in case the card that I'm holding RAW files on somehow breaks or goes crazy or just totally loses it. Then I'll have a backup. And in my case, I have a 132 gigabyte SD card and a 32 gigabyte compact flash card. Since the SD card is so much bigger, I write RAWs to that, and since the 32 gigabyte compact flash card is relatively small, I write normal JPEGs to that. And most of the time, I think a normal JPEG is fine. If I've taken the picture right, it's not every photo where I've totally messed up the white balance and really need the RAW file. Anyway, so RAW versus JPEG, your choice. Thank you very much.